You may be seated. Padre Gotuma was sitting in a psychoanalyst's waiting room in Australia being about the furthest place he could flee to from his old life in Ireland. He was inspecting a brochure rack very intently, a strategy for avoiding eye contact with anyone else in the room, when he came across a phrase in Irish, of all things. I won't hazard a pronunciation, but the phrase he read translates, "It is in the shelter of each other that the people live." 10,000 miles from home and very much alone, Padraig reads a message in the language of his childhood. It is in the shelter of each other that the people live. But he knows his Irish well enough to know the word scathe can mean shelter or shadow. It is in the shadow of each other that the people live is probably not what the brochure's author had in mind, but it can also be true, can't it? Sometimes other people are the ones who block the sun. Sometimes we're the ones who block the light from others. Padraig soon moved from Australia to Belfast. He'd been a migrant for nearly a decade, moving from his home in Cork to Dublin to Switzerland to Australia, with stops in Lithuania, Uganda, and the Philippines along the way. He was ready to settle, ready to make a place a home again. But in Belfast, where he could read the road signs and even unpack the etymology of the place names, in Belfast, of all places, on the same island he'd been born on, 100 miles from Dublin and a car trip from Cork, he didn't know whether the next person he'd meet would greet him as a local or as a dangerous foreigner. "I love Cork," one man told him. "It's a great county." "Oh, you're from Ireland," another would say. "I was in Finland once." He learned quickly that people were listening for slips of the tongue by which they determine whose side you were on, whether you'd say Northern Ireland or the North, or if you called Britain the mainland or across the water, whether you went to Mass or to church, and whether you carried a Bible along with you when you did. Language can be a shelter, and language can be a shadow. It's hard to say when and where a migrant will actually feel at home. That one can feel so displaced, so close to what should be home, is a reminder that we are all of us migrants in a way, all of us. We all move, and we can all be made to feel included or very much on the outside whenever we do. Now, maybe you've never thought of the parable we know of as the Good Samaritan as a story about migration or a story for migrants, but it is, in a very important way, I think. The story comes right after an important turn in the Gospel of Luke. We heard about this just a couple of Sundays ago, right? When the days drew near for him to be taken up, Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. Things get a little graver in the Gospel here, a little more intense. All those strange sayings follow. Remember them? Foxes have holes and birds of the air have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. It's where he says, "Let the dead bury their own dead, and no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom." The language gets stark as Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem, the place where his own rejection as a dangerous outsider will be complete. This ominous language has a very specific purpose, however. It's meant to prepare 70 people whom Jesus is sending out, 2 by 2, to scout out the towns along the way. Remember them. Last week we heard about the 70. He says he's sending them out like lambs into the midst of wolves, sending them into a world where strangers and foreigners will not always find welcome. I can imagine the people hearing all this must have been nervously making mental checklists of what weapons they'd need to carry for self-defense and what provisions they'd need to pack for a trip through a world as inhospitable as this one. I would have been well into my list when Jesus says, "Oh, and another thing. Carry not only no weapons, carry no purse, no bag, no sandals." He says, "I'm sending you into towns as people with nothing to offer, no resources, no wealth, no protection, no markers of status or citizenship, nothing. You will arrive in these places with only your humanity. And if you're not welcomed, Shake the dust from your feet and move on. God's judgment will be upon the place where a stranger finds no welcome. This is why I say the parable of the Samaritan's kindness is a migrant story. It's another story set very intentionally along a road, and one that very intentionally includes a foreigner. And it's told here, right on the heels of 70 of Jesus' disciples having been sent on an empty-handed mission through their world to see where they'll find welcome and where they will not. You probably remember the setup to the parable. It's a lawyer, of course, who wants to know what he must do. Got that? Not who he must be, but what he must do to inherit eternal life. So Jesus sends the lawyer back to his law, and the law says you have to love. That's what you have to do. Love God and love your neighbor. That's how one steps into eternal life, by loving. But then we learn the lawyer's real agenda, right? He doesn't actually want to take up a loving way of life. He wants to justify himself. I recognize this response. So he asks, well, who is my neighbor? Which is really a way of asking, okay, who am I legally obligated to love in order to get eternal life for myself? Now, I'd like us to pause right here for just a second. Our Irish friend Padraig once said that he was mostly bored by Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but one word stuck with him from the book. It's the Japanese word mu, M-U. It's a one-word response to a really bad question. And friends, there are such things as bad questions. The Zen response is mu. It means unask the question. Well, the parable Jesus tells is effectively a mu, is it not? The question was, who am I obligated to love? What category of people? The lawyer wants to justify his place among a category of people, and if love of neighbor is what secures his place, he just needs to know who counts as a neighbor. But the story doesn't tell the lawyer who his neighbor is at all, does it? The story doesn't narrow things down. A man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho. That's how the parable begins, right? A man. The category of the person who's going to need mercy is simply human. If you let any other category rise to the level of this one, tribe, nation, religion, priest, Levite, Samaritan, American, Mexican, Syrian, Irish, these human inventions have their place in our lives. But compared to the category human being, they are fleeting and they are small. And if they get in the way of our mercy, they are nothing less than the enemies of Christ. Who is my neighbor? Mu. Unask the question. Because the point is not to determine whom you're obligated to love. The point is that in the act of mercy, in the act of loving the next human being you meet who needs it, we step right now into the eternal life Jesus kept telling us all about. Jesus unasked a bad question, and he told us a better story. Expanded our imagination about who might be included and just how large our mercy might become if we followed him. A story that dismantled the categories we make up to justify ourselves and exclude other children of God from this law of love. A story that showed us, yet again, a more excellent way to live. When the world asks us terrible questions, like whether a family, a child, a woman, a man who crosses a border without papers deserves to be treated with the dignity of a fellow human being. When the world asks us a bad question, Jesus insists that we answer it with a better story, a fuller story, a truer story born of a moral imagination of biblical proportions. A story that reminds us perhaps that it really is in the shelter, not the shadow of one another, that people truly come to life. These are the kind of things we need for the tired spaces of our world, Padre Gotuma once wrote. This is the way we need to move forward in a world that is so interested in being comforted by the damp blanket of bad stories. We need stories of belonging that move us towards each other, not from each other. Ways of being human that open up the possibilities of being alive together. Ways of navigating our differences that deepen our curiosity, that deepen our friendship, that deepen our capacity to disagree, that deepen the argument of being alive. This is what we need. This is what will save us. This is the work of peace. This is the work of imagination. Amen.